This was all this was always a very major piece that was going to be focused on. I think everybody's recommended these big changes to Article 7. And we could do this in a series of amendments. So normally we've done 300 different amendments to an article, trying to change one thing at a time. I think that to some extent doesn't move us in the direction, move us where we need to be quick enough. And also is it kind of overwhelms voters in making all those individual points. So the Constitution gives us the authority and the ability to go and rewrite an entire article at once. That is included in the constitutional amendment, section of the current Constitution. And so that's what we opted to do, was to go through and look through Article 7, make all the changes that we think needed to be made, and kind of package them all together in a way that we can really move the state forward with one single amendment and one single vote. So with that, let's go through it a little bit about some of the high points about what is in there. I mean, obviously it's about 115-page long amendment, so it's not a very simple thing. But at the end of the day, it has a lot of different things in there that are all critical. First of all, it does cap the maximum rate of income tax. The current maximum rate in the Constitution is 4.75%. It lowers that to 3.75%. Currently, our rate after the tax reforms last year is now a flat rate of 3%. So that doesn't actually lower the rate that's in the rate that's in place right now. It really just prevents the legislature from raising that cap or raising that top interest rate beyond that 3.75% in the future. It also doubles the standard deduction for seniors. So as a result of the reforms last year, we almost tripled the standard deduction for every taxpayer. So it went from $4,500 to $12,500. Should this amendment pass, it will basically double that for everyone over 65 in the state, which will result in basically the first $25,000 of income being tax-free for every senior in Louisiana. I think that's necessary because we did make some changes a few years ago that had a disproportionately negative effect on seniors and the income tax that they owed. And so this is somewhat undoing some of those changes and some of the harmful effects that those previous reforms had. And so I think it is a very positive move, especially to be competitive and attracting retirees. So obviously Texas and Florida don't charge income tax at all. Mississippi, right next door, doesn't tax retirement income. So it does make us more competitive on that front. Some of the important tax changes, one of the things we did is put a prohibition, or really a 2/3 vote requirement for any new, I would say, special interest tax break, credits, incentives, exemptions. In the future, they'll require a 2/3 vote if the amendment passes. That's pretty important because we really spent a lot of time in this last legislative session and the special session on tax reform, going through our tax code, getting rid of a lot of exemptions and credits and incentives, and really lowering the rates for everybody. And what we want to do is, going forward, continue that focus on lowering rates for everyone as to a method of making Louisiana more competitive, making our tax code more competitive. And that amendment's very important for that. We also put in place a government growth limit that will restrict the growth of the general fund. It doesn't cap, the money that's taken in by the state, but it does restrict the growth of these kind of recurring expenses that I think both as a fiscal responsibility measure and as a way of eventually eliminating the income tax or continuing to look for tax reductions. It sets aside that revenue so that it can be used for either further tax reductions, funding infrastructure, or these one-time expenses. So I think it's a very good fiscal responsibility measure that gets put in the Constitution. We make a few other changes to the funds piece of the Constitution. There's about 25 constitutional funds currently in there. Some of them are never really used. They're just kind of dormant, locked in the Constitution. Some of them are in there, and I think we can use it for a better purpose. Some of it just kind of restricts the legislature's flexibility to solve today's challenges. And so we kind of took an opportunity based on those PAR recommendations to go in there and fix some of the funds that are locked up in the Constitution. The first one that I think is significant are the two savings accounts that currently are in the Constitution. The Budget Stabilization Fund is our rainy day fund, kind of our emergency fund. If we have a budget shortfall, that's where you pull the money from. And then the second one is the Revenue Stabilization Fund, which is a more recently created fund that basically takes deposits of our corporate income tax, corporate tax, and severance tax, and then basically puts it aside and says, once we get $5 billion, we'll use this money on infrastructure. But we looked at that and said, well, maybe we don't need two different funds. We can maybe combine those, almost triple the balance of that rainy day emergency fund, which has more restrictions, is better protected for actual emergencies, and then redirect those corporate revenues and severance revenues to the general fund so that the legislature can use them for infrastructure problems that we have now. And so we thought that flexibility was necessary while providing a very responsible cushion in that emergency rainy day fund. And so it'll be one of the best funded emergency funds in the country once that's done. And then we will have more flexibility for the legislature with those corporate and severance revenues, which have been basically locked up in this other revenue stabilization fund going forward. The other significant change in the constitutional funds is on the educational funds. We have these trust funds in the Constitution that lock up about $2 billion. And those have been locked up basically since the 80s, or the majority of that money's been locked up since the 80s. And, the state has changed since then. So in the 80s, we never paid any money toward our retirement debt. We had this huge outstanding liability, and we never made any payments to it. And it wasn't really until 2012 we actually started paying down the principal on that retirement debt. So currently for the teachers' retirement system, that debt is about $8 billion. We pay 7.25% on it. So it's a pretty significant amount of money we spend every year on this debt and on the interest on that debt. And so the money that sits in the trust fund, it earns about $50 million a year. It doesn't, it's about 3% interest. So there's a pretty significant, savings that we would have by actually using that debt to pay it off because we get a higher rate of return. And then the savings that we would see every year would be about $300 million from making that payment. And so 200 million of that will accrue to the K through 12 school districts across the state, and about 86 million or so will go to higher education and savings for higher education from the contributions that they no longer have to make to pay off that retirement debt from that reduced amount. And so we looked at that and we said, well, hey, how about we use those savings that the K through 12 districts have to give the teachers a permanent pay raise? The legislature has been giving a $2,000 stipend annually for the last 2 years. And we said, hey, look, we can actually make that permanent by making this big debt payment and reducing the amount of money that the districts have to pay on these retirement contributions. And so it's a pretty, I would say, fiscally responsible mechanism. One, it pays off a significant amount of debt. It saves about $1 billion in interest. As I said, about $200 million a year for the K through 12 system. And then you're able to give teachers a permanent pay raise using that money. And I'd also like to point out that $2,000 amount is really the minimum amount that the teachers could earn extra, because there'll be about $40 million in excess savings beyond the cost of that raise. And so that money has very specific uses it can be used for, either additional raises or curriculum, or that's really the only thing that school districts can use it for. So there is the opportunity that even a greater raise than that $2,000 they've been seeing on a recurring basis, that there's even an opportunity for a greater raise than that. So I think that's important to note. And then there's also the about $86 million in savings for higher education. So higher ed will save about $86 million, and that money can go to solve whatever other problems there are. There is about $50 million a year, as I noted, that would previously flow from those trust funds. But that 50 million can be replaced by the legislature. I mean, obviously, just the savings in higher ed alone is 86 million. And the governor and the administration is committed to backfilling that money with I think about 27 million or $20 million that higher ed gets currently for their scholarship funds and everything else. And there's some other dollars in those educational funds too that will have to be backfilled. But it is you're making a pretty significant change in saving 300 million a year or $286 million a year, and really the offset is you're only losing $50 million a year in that annual expenditure. So you could make that up in that difference. And so I think there is a lot of things in this amendment. Obviously, it's pretty substantial, but it does put Louisiana on a very solid track moving forward. It fixes a lot of these problems that have been historical. The last thing I think on the tax side is it really does improve us in that it gives us the opportunity to get rid of the inventory tax, which is one of the most punishing taxes that Louisiana has, one of the ones that make us most uncompetitive. I think it really, devastates a lot of rural parishes. And so it gives the opportunity for those parishes to opt out. It gives them an incentive payment to kind of smooth them over so that they can make that opt out. And I think that's really important in making Louisiana competitive going forward. But the combination of all these changes, I understand it's a lot, but I think it's all things that are necessary, things that have been recommended for a long time. And I think things that will really see Louisiana build on the success we're seeing in the last year, and I think really lay the foundation for future success. And so I'm excited about it. I think that I've been all over the state. I went all over the state talking to people, getting their input last year in the run up to the tax reform session. So I got input from different groups all across the state. I don't know that I turned down a meeting with anybody here at my office in Baton Rouge. And now I'm going around the state, I think, just trying to educate people on the benefits of Constitutional Amendment 2 and why they should support it. And so with that, I know Secretary Bourgeois has a lot of thoughts on this amendment too, and I'm happy to turn it over to her. I think she's more eloquent and knowledgeable than I am, I think, and so I'm glad to have her here.
Well, thank you, Secretary Nelson. And the more knowledgeable is not fair at all, because I sat here for the last 10 minutes thinking, thank goodness Richard was on this call with us, just because the amount of just the technical aspects of what this amendment does is critically important, needless to say. And I was on a bit of a roadshow for the last couple of weeks with Secretary Gray from the Department of Energy and Natural Resources, and not unlike this dialogue, I felt like there's a little bit of sizzle and a little bit of steak. So Richard, you're the steak on this one, just like Tyler was, and I'm hoping to be the sizzle, because to me, so much of our role here at LED is about changing the narrative around Louisiana and the Louisiana opportunity. And everything we have done since the beginning of this administration at LED has been about positioning Louisiana to win. That's sort of the banner under which all of our work has folded. And this is just one of those critical steps, right? The things we were able to accomplish in that 3-week special session in November were really meaty, significant pieces of progress as it relates to our tax code. But this is another really meaty, significant piece of progress in that as well. And so that's just as critical to us. I want to say two important things about it from an economic development perspective. One, I think, is obvious, but I want to be clear. When companies look at investing here, either in an expansion, in a new location, in growth, whatever it is, there are two critical things that they look at first before we're either going to make the list or we're not. And number one is the cost of doing business there. Number two is the ease of doing business there. There's a lot we have done and can do and continue to do in the Landry administration to make sure the ease of doing business here is real. But the cost of doing business here is first. And so all the work that we did under Richard's leadership, certainly in November, was critical to that. But this piece is just as critical to that, not the least of which is the inventory tax that Secretary Nelson mentioned. It is wildly uncompetitive. 40 other states don't have it. And what this amendment does is it does give us the ability now for every parish to make their own decision, but also here at LED, and I'm sure revenue as well, to work individually with those parishes to sort of see what their pathway is, right? To give, as best from an advice and counsel perspective, position each of those 64 parishes to be successful individually so that the state can be. The other thing I want to add that I think to all of you in the media on this call, hopefully is noticeable. I've been around Louisiana a long time, born and raised here, and have spent the most of my adult life here. I don't believe I have ever seen an issue or an initiative be approached with such a whole of government approach that we're using here. I mean, if you're on social media, you see legislators doing videos on it. You see our trade associations doing videos on it. I mean, obviously the secretary has been all over the state. The governor has been all over the state. Legislative members, I'm doing the same thing. And I would hope from a press perspective, you all both recognize it and sort of take something away from that just like we believe economic development requires a whole of government approach, I think you're just seeing a whole of government approach to this amendment and the intentionality trying to get it passed and trying to communicate with our citizens the importance of it. So at the end of the day, what we continue to do from a positioning Louisiana to win perspective is just to continue to put policies both practical, statutory, and philosophical, right, in practice to make sure that Louisiana is positioned to win. And this is just another critical piece of that puzzle.
Thank you so much, Secretary Bourgeois. I did not see anybody post in the chat that they had questions, but did want to open that up to questions just in case anybody had some at this moment. So, does anyone here want to get some questions out to the secretaries? Do not see any so far.
That's how thorough we were. We got answered all the questions in advance. I don't know that that's ever happened to me before.
It is. It's unusual not to get questions, but if you all have questions, you can certainly reach out to us and we can try to get those answered for you offline. I want to thank both Secretary Bourgeois and Secretary Nelson for giving such a informative presentation each. And again, this will be up on YouTube within an hour, so feel free to use the video.
Right, we got a
Looks like we
question,
have
Kevin.
one question from Kelly. Do you want to come off mute and ask your question?
Sure. Thanks so much. I'm with Biz New Orleans. I do the digital business news. And I was just wondering how, if it's passed, how will it help attract or impact data centers and also the energy sector? You know, you were there at the CERAWeek, and I know there's a lot going on. So I was just wondering about those two industries in particular.
I think primarily from an industry perspective, that answer would really be focused on the inventory tax piece, which is again, just a really non-competitive tax for us. So the location of those facilities, be it energy related or data center, would be based on what the parish decides to do. But I will say in a higher level conversation, what it allows is it continues to put Louisiana sort of much higher up on the map for people to consider. I will say that is the feedback we got at CERAWeek all last week, that there's sort of this what's going on in Louisiana interest. It's palpable about the aggressive changes that we're making. I think it's another one of those statements that shows we are serious about being competitive. So specific to the industry, it primarily would be around inventory tax. And it would depend on what parishes decide. And to Secretary Nelson's point, this constitutional amendment gives us the ability to then go work with each of those 64 parishes and show their competitive advantage, or maybe what they do or don't have to offer in that space. There are a lot of rural parishes who really want the opportunity to be even more competitive than they are today to attract new investment. There's some other parishes that perhaps because of their positioning, be it on the river or otherwise, that feel like maybe inventory tax is one they're willing to continue, but that's going to be a parish by parish decision. But the energy investment, particularly because of the size and scope of what they put in their facilities, is paying very close attention to what we do here.
Thanks so much, Kelly. Are there any other questions from any other reporters that would like to get in before we wrap this up? Right, seeing none, as I said, this will be up on YouTube for those who need the video and the audio. And we really appreciate everybody joining. I appreciate the secretaries taking time out of your day, and hope everyone has a great week. Thanks.
Thank y'all.
Thank you, guys.